everybody. Welcome back to the Come Off Conqueror show. I'm your host, Bonnie, and with me today is my dear friend and colleague, Debbie Comstock. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm happy to be here.
Debbie is amazing, you guys. If I were to literally read off every single certification and training and degree and all of her accolades, we would be here for an hour just reading off her list. Debbie's been a social worker for about 30 years now, and she's on so many different boards and coalitions and all these different things that this woman knows what she's talking about when it comes to abuse and abuse prevention and child abuse prevention and pretty much anything and everything centered around mental health. So I have been, I don't want to say working with her. I've been, she's been more like a mentor really for the last few years. And I just adore her because she is so smart and she knows everything under the sun when it comes to this category. So let me tell you a little bit about her. Right now, she's on the Domestic Violence Coalition for our state and also our northern area of Utah and the Davis County Coalition as well. And she's a CASA advocate. She works with the state doing basically quality control for children's welfare services. It's probably the easiest way to say what she does, right? She makes sure that she keeps them in line.
I got my eye on them.
It's great. And then she also has her own clinical practice doing EMDR. So you guys know I talk about that a lot, and I've referred quite a few of you over to Debbie when you have talked about doing some subconscious work and wanting to release some trauma. EMDR is great for that. So maybe if we have time, I'll have her kind of explain a little bit more about what EMDR is. But for today's purposes, I asked her to come on the show because I get a lot of questions from people, I feel like monthly, if not more often than that. People are asking how to identify abusive relationships and how to know if you're in one that's bad enough that you need to get out, or what's the difference between abuse and just a toxic relationship. Or often I get phone calls, hey, my sister or my cousin or this girl I know is in a really bad situation. I don't know what to make of it. What should we do? And then they start telling me the situation. And sure enough, it's abuse. And then I start listing off resources and things that they can do. So for a long time now, I felt like we should just do a video with Debbie explaining what abuse is. What do you do when you're in that situation? How do you get out safely? How do you know if you need to get out? And just answer some of the most common questions centered around abusive relationships. So with that in mind, if you have any questions, please type them in the comments. I'll make sure that if I don't know the answer, I will reach out to Debbie so that she can answer your questions as well. And obviously you can join our Facebook group and our community so that if you need more support, we can be here for you. And then clearly go through some of the resources and suggestions that Debbie's going to give us today if you need even more support. We love you guys. We are here for you. We just want you to be safe and happy. And hopefully throughout this whole video, you can feel how much love and compassion we have for you and concern for you and your family. So without any further ado, Debbie, drum roll, let's dive in.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, our first question for you is, how do you know if you're in an abusive relationship versus just a toxic one?
That's a really good question because you have to sort of ask yourself, why is it just feeling toxic? Which sounds like it's not real bad. And what makes it abuse? And the reality is both of those things are really the same thing. It's just the way that it's happening. So something that we've been talking a lot about in our DV work is the concept of coercive control. And coercive control is when you are being coerced to do things you don't really want to do, but you don't really feel like you have a choice. So, for example, I worked with a woman one time, And there's a lot of other elements of domestic violence, but one of the coercive control things that was done is that in the morning, her husband would give her an amount of money for her to be able to go to the store just that day to buy the food he wanted prepared for dinner. And that's all she got. So when she came back, she'd better have that and prepare his meals. Now, there were so many other bad things going on in terms of hitting, kicking, pushing, that she didn't realize in all the areas where she was being controlled. So if you start piecing it out to the things that are happening, if you're experiencing things that cause you to feel shame or less than yourself, though that's emotional abuse. And let's face it, we all say things sometimes we don't mean. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying, that if you've done that or have had that, but the best way to look at domestic violence, it is a pattern of coercive control that can include things like withholding finances, sexual abuse, physical abuse for sure, spiritual abuse, which is one that we don't always talk about, mm-hmm. but it's right there. Mm-hmm. So if you're beginning to see a pattern in any of these areas where there is control, in other words, you don't feel like you could have a voice to say something different, that is abuse. You are in an abusive relationship. The key is the pattern that continues to go.
How often does this abuse need to occur for it to be a pattern, to be considered a pattern?
I would say if it's the same thing all the time, every day. So here's one that this woman didn't really think was being coerced. When they went to church on Sunday, she was not allowed to walk into the chapel until her husband walked in first. And when he walked in first, then the rest of the family could come. I know, and I saw your reaction, Bonnie, but she just thought that was a way they could really represent their family in terms of having a strong male role model. She thought it was kind of stupid, and she didn't think about it very much until one time she tried to walk in first because just the way they were arranged. And she was reprimanded immediately. Like, oh no, we don't do that. So that was definitely a pattern in her life. Mm-hmm. And as she looked at that, she began to see where there were other patterns for different things. It's like, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Mm-hmm. So not necessarily the same behavior repeated, but a pattern of control and coerciveness and shaming and things like that. So like they might one day withhold money and then the next day they might control what you say at a family party or to wear or something like that. It's really just about the pattern of control. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We have a video, I can link to it below, guys, on sexual abuse. I go into the difference between assault and rape and what is rape and stuff like that, and get a little bit more into sexual assault in that video. I would love to do more videos on the different types of abuse. So if there is a certain type of abuse that you want more information about, let me know in the comments, and I'll make sure if Debbie's willing, we can do a short one on those different things. But you touched on spiritual abuse. Mm-hmm. Can you take just a couple minutes to explain spiritual abuse? Because it is super confusing and nuanced, and I don't think most of us really understand what it is.
Well, it's a little easier to talk about in the state of Utah, just because there is a predominant religion. Now, I didn't grow up in Utah. I've been in Utah now for about 10 years. And it's very apparent to me where there are cultural differences here in the state of Utah versus what I was doing in California. Oh, California's got its own issue for sure. But spiritual abuse is pretty easy to recognize if you stop to think about what is doctrine and what is culture. Mm-hmm. When it's doctrine, and depending on how it's being interpreted, I mean, if you go to the website and you look at the doctrines of the church, you're going to find things like revelation and things like that. But when that gets to be a problem is when a person who's trying to control you indicates that they're receiving revelation for you and that this is what you must do. And that's not true. You, according to the doctrine, you have the right to receive that revelation as well, or some kind of a confirmation that it's okay to proceed. You don't have to always go blind. Now, that's not confused with the fact that you might have some faith and decide to start on a path. But if you get there and it doesn't feel right, you can say something. You can say something about it. So, putting the man in your life as the head of everything, there's a reason to have somebody in charge. I tell my husband that the reason he's in charge is because if the Savior came to our house and wanted an accountability, I would say, go ahead and speak. Go ahead and speak, and I'll tell you if you're hitting everything right, and then I'll check in with you. But you know what it is, so go ahead. But that it's not anything more than that. He's a voice. And I think for a long time, and I hope it's okay, Bonnie, that I'm talking about it from this perspective.
Yeah, no, it's great. A lot of our viewers are LDS, so I think it's
well, maybe for others who are not, this could help them understand the perspective better. I am so impressed that in the last few years, there's been more discussion about women in their roles and women in the priesthood. And we have been elevated to a point where we are recognized for the roles we have in our homes, that our callings are administered, our priesthood callings in what we respond in. And we've known for a long time, but not talked about it much, is that when women work in the temple, they receive priesthood in order to do those ordinances. So just because
priesthood authority,
exactly priesthood authority,
right. And in those particular roles, and it's interesting how we have the priesthood anyway when we're endowed, right? Like we receive priesthood power. It's the authority to use it under certain circumstances.
And women sometimes get confused or have a hard time if they think they're going to leave a relationship, that they need to leave a relationship. We've been told you do not have to stay in an abusive relationship. You do not. But women get really worried about if they're sealed to that person. But I want to point out to you that when you are sealed, the person that you're sealed to is Heavenly Father. With each other together to Heavenly Father. If one person on that triangle falls off, I kind of see it like Heavenly Father's here, and then here we are on each side. You'll notice that if you haven't been there for a while, the covenants that you make are to Heavenly Father.
Yep.
Through Heavenly Father, not to each other.
That was my favorite change.
One falls off, you still are entitled to all those blessings, no matter what.
I just want to read one quote that you brought up, and it just so happens to be the quote of the day on my little calendar thing. It's by Bruce R. McConkie, and it's from his article from 1980 in the New Era called How to Get Personal Revelation. And this quote is, "Revelation is something that should be received by every individual. Because God operates on principles of eternal, universal, and never deviating law, any individual who abides the law that entitles him to get revelation can know exactly and precisely what President Kimball knows, or any prophet, can entertain angels just as well as Joseph Smith entertained them, and can be in tune in full measure with all of the things of the Spirit." Any individual.
That's pretty powerful.
Say men or women. He just said, or black or white or anything like that. He just said any individual. And so I think that helps explain spiritual abuse. Thank you. Let's go back to, so what do you do if you find that you're in a abusive or toxic, because now we know they're synonymous with each other. I kind of feel like people who say toxic, it's because they're trying to downplay.
Yeah, it's hard to
that
face.
it's abuse.
It's hard to face that it could be happening to you with someone that you love.
Yes, exactly. I think, I remember when I realized that I was trapped in this cycle of finding abusive men over and over and over again. And the day I realized it, it was such a blow to my self-esteem. I felt like, how can I be here again? Like, it was just so humiliating and defeating. And I just felt like, am I a worthless person? Do I keep attracting these people? We're going to get back to that at the end, guys. We're going to talk about how to break that cycle at the end. Definitely. So stay tuned. But the first question to that is, what do you do if you find yourself in an abusive relationship? What's the first thing you should do?
Well, from my perspective, one of the things that you need to do is to think about all of the areas where you think there may be abuse or coercive control. And I'll tell you, it does not have to be physical for it to be abusive. And key into that is, if you're familiar with the case of Susan Powell, in that case, he, as far as we know, he never hit her. He never hit her, but the abuse was intense. So writing down those areas and just be asking yourself, how safe do you feel? How safe do you feel? In two areas, emotionally and physically. So physical safety, if that's breached, the person is feeling like they need to get help right away, like they're hurt. If they don't get help, they could die. So a lot of what happens is emotional abuse. And emotional abuse is anything that happens that causes you to feel humiliated or less than, or if you don't have your autonomy. I love the way it's described in SAMHSA's guidelines, because it says loss of autonomy. And that's what we were just talking about, being your own independent person to move forward on things. For, of course, as a couple, you have goals together and ways to do those things. But it doesn't mean you have to put your sights on hold the whole time. So those are the things that happen that are mostly emotional abuse. But knowing when it's time to leave, is that what you're talking about?
So first thing is becoming aware. So admitting the truth about the situation, analyzing what's going on. You might need the help of a trusted friend or a life coach or a therapist or somebody to help you kind of think through it and sometimes identify the truth. I think sometimes when you're in, how does that phrase go? It's hard to see the forest through the trees, right?
Yes.
Sometimes when you're in the middle of it, it's really hard for you to see. So if you're starting to become aware, ask one of your friends that knows you really well for their opinion. And I can almost guarantee you a lot of them will be able to see. Now, granted, if your abuser is a narcissist, man or woman, because abusers come in all shapes and sizes and all genders. If your abuser is a narcissist, there's a good chance that they're hiding. They're so charismatic that they have the ability to turn it on and off when when they can't show their true colors. So what do we do in that case, Debbie? How do you see through the gaslighting? And
so can I give you an example of a situation that's right here in Utah?
Absolutely.
And it's being talked about very openly. But several months ago, there was a report of a man in his office in Salt Lake, and he had shot his son, his 16-year-old son.
This is the saddest story.
And shot himself. Now, at first glance, it's like, okay, he just committed suicide. That's the way it was being talked about. Until you started putting pieces together. One, he did it Mother's Day weekend. So who do you think he was trying to hurt?
That poor mom. She had been trying for years to get the courts to do something about all this abuse, and they weren't listening. I really hope that this is going to change our legal system.
Well, that's, one of my projects that I'm working on. But what the reality is, when people really begin to think about it, is Because when I saw the reports on the news, everyone was just talking about how charismatic he was, how much he helped people, that he went out of his way to do things, that he used his own resources. So it was sort of like, no, this can't be.
Right.
Except that his wife had left him like 5 years previous. No, actually 9 years, because she was abused.
Yeah.
And then the courts, well, there had been a recommendation that perhaps she should have custody of her son, which would immediately put him over the edge. I'm speculating, which is, if I can't have him, nobody will. And that's a very common thing with a narcissist. So that woman, she knew to get out. She didn't have the support she needed to protect all of her children. But here's a way you could know if it's time to get out. In the state of Utah, we talk pretty openly about something called the danger assessment.
Mm-hmm.
The danger assessment is an evidence-based tool that, and I love the fact that it's evidence-based because it helps me feel very confident in administering it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're certified and administer this tool, the person doing so can score it for you, tell you what your score is, and then tell you where your score puts you in what range. If it puts you in a range where this feels really unsafe, you should be watching it, to a variable rate, which is, this sounds like it could change any minute. So let's do somewhat of a safety plan to recognize if there's change. And then there's the level where I can look right at her and say, based upon all the thousands of women who have been given this questionnaire, you are highly at risk of being killed by your partner. So we talk about it very frankly, that if you're in this range, you're at risk of being killed. And the safety planning for you needs to be on board and intense right now. Now, you might say, okay, well, Deb, where am I going to get a danger assessment, right? Mm-hmm. Well, fortunately, within the next month or so, Bonnie will be certified on the danger assessment. And I do have people call me sometimes and say, you know, I think I'm in an abusive relationship. And I'll pull the assessment up on my computer and ask them the questions and score it and tell them and give them the range. And then I say, so what would you like to do now? What would you like me to help you with? But let's say you don't have Bonnie, you don't have me to call. There's another thing you can do. One of my favorites is you can download an app on your phone called My Plan. My Plan.
I'll link to it down below in the show notes.
And when you download this app, first it makes you select a code that only lets you in, so that if somebody got a hold of your phone, it comes up, they can't get into it to see how you've answered questions. And Bonnie, it's actually a good resource that somebody can walk through the very things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And see if they're happening to them.
Perfect.
And when it gets through, it will ask you the danger assessment questions. It will score it for you, and it will tell you exactly what I'm saying to you. I noticed a new feature on this the other day, which was, if you're in the middle of doing something in this app, if someone comes in, you simply hit one of the tabs, I don't remember what it is, and it goes to a screen that looks like you're organizing your day. Going nice. Shopping, making a grocery list, so that you feel safe about looking about this information. It's a great tool.
I love it. That's
a great tool.
And that answers, like, I've been wanting to do some sort of safety assessment on our website. So we'll just link to the My Plan, and you guys can use that, and that'll be perfect. So when you don't really even need to talk to somebody then if you use that, but maybe I think it's better. Someone will help you kind of like work through some of it and process it. Is that kind of the goal?
I think it's better when you talk with someone, because sometimes talking with someone helps you identify things that are happening that you didn't think about. So, for example, I think it's easier to see abuse in someone else's relationship than your own.
Yep.
But then when you turn around and apply it to you, it's a little harder to stay in denial. And it's a little harder to stay in denial when you're talking with someone.
So maybe does the person who's administering the question say, if someone was in this situation, how would you do it? Like,
No, I just say to her, I'm going to ask you these questions, and all you have to do is say yes or no.
okay.
And the very first question that sort of catches her off guard is something about, is the abuse increasing? Mm-hmm. And many times they'll say, no. But one of the things that comes with the danger assessment is a calendar. Mm. And you ask her to mark on there days and times and what happened during that abuse, so that when she has started filling out 10 or 15 and it's increasing, she can't deny that it's increasing. And that just helps her think through it. Yeah. Because that's a frontal cortex job. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if you're not in your frontal cortex, which you're usually not when you're triggered, right, that's a hard thing to think about.
Oh, absolutely. Your limbic system's all going crazy, yeah, right? On
totally.
You. Okay. So, all right. So we've answered, what should I do if I find myself in a situation? So contact somebody, do the safety assessment, really think about becoming aware of what's going on. She even gave us the suggestion just now of calendaring it, creating a journal, and cataloging. You're going to need that catalog if you end up pressing charges anyway. The court systems are really going to want that documentation. Pictures, videos, all sorts of things like that are really helpful.
And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to call the police if you're being physically hurt, intimidated with a weapon. It's actually a felony for someone to take your phone away from you. That's a felony. So if he will not allow you to have your phone, call the police. Okay.
So that was my next question, which is, when do you know that you need to call support, and who does that support look like?
If it's imminent, like when we're talking about physical safety, that's the time to be calling the police for sure.
Okay.
So if you feel like your life is in danger, and I'll give you a little clue with the danger assessment, when we score that tool, some of the questions are weighted differently based on the action, because some of those actions make that person more lethal to you than others. One of the things that makes them very lethal is if they strangle you or choke you.
Yeah.
Strangling or choking, any putting hands on the neck, you may call the police. There may not be any evidence that they've done that. They didn't squeeze hard enough. If you actually pass out, lose consciousness, you should go to a doctor, an urgent care, an ER right away, because the act of constricting your blood or your airway can have repercussions as long as 6 months down the road, where you could have a stroke. Extremely dangerous. And what you want more than anything is documentation that you have been telling someone and asking for a police report. That will come in very handy if you need to get a protective order. So call the police. Don't be afraid to. They're going to be a little neutral, if you will, because they're looking for evidence that a crime has occurred. That's what they're looking for. But you need to know that in the state of Utah, law enforcement is trained on something called the lethality assessment protocol, which means if a woman has said that she's being abused, they basically administer about the first 8 to 12 questions on the danger assessment.
Okay.
Just enough to give them some perspective. And then the protocol says they immediately give that person access to a phone, who they can speak with a DV advocate right away.
So I remember from my domestic violence advocacy training that I did a few years ago, I remember being shocked at what she taught us about strangling and how detrimental it is to us. You touched on it a little bit about how in 6 months down the road, you can have a stroke. How severe does the strangulation need to be for it to be impact your health, like your memory and things like that? I feel like it was not all that, like, it didn't need to be that severe of strangulation for it to actually be really dangerous.
It's dangerous anytime somebody puts their hands on your neck. That's very dangerous, because you don't know exactly where their hand is being placed, you don't know if you're going to be losing breath or if you're going to be passing out. If they constrict the blood, you're going to start to lose consciousness. It's going to feel like you're fainting. The one thing about that happening too is evidence of that happening is that women get little red dots in their eyes, petechia.
The red eyes.
And that is evidence that there's been an effort to constrict your blood. Airway, same thing. You're going to feel like you're passing out, but if you feel like you just can't get air or a full breath even, let's just say putting hands on neck at all is extremely dangerous.
Okay. And I think I remember the statistics. If they've done that, if you've been strangled, the statistics go up for your risk of being killed. Like they're more
dangerous assessment.
To actually, like, not necessarily kill you with strangulation, but another form too. Like it just you're just like drastically.
Yes. Well, remember I told you some of the questions are weighted. So while one question might be, okay, that's 1 point, then we get to strangulation and other ones, and that could be as many as, oh, that's 3 because it ups the ante. Then we total your score on the yeses. And then from there we go.
So if in imminent danger, we call the police. If not in imminent danger, meaning we are in physically being harmed immediately, like in immediate danger that way, or our kids. Remember, this isn't just about you, but anyone in your household, including a pet, if they're abusing your pet.
That's right.
Still dangerous. If they're throwing things, even though it may not be at you, but throwing stuff at the wall, is that considered immediate danger?
I would call the police if someone is breaking things in your home. Okay. If they're destroying property, that's a police call.
Okay.
That's definitely a police call.
And the police might not make any charges, you guys. They might come to calm things down. But what you're doing is you're establishing a pattern, right? And you're establishing that you're contacting people so that if things get worse, you have this documentation, like she was saying, you're establishing that pattern, you have record that this is happening. And on top of that, you're also sending a sign to your abuser, look, I'm not going to take this bull crap.
Right.
I'm going to stand up for myself. You need to stop.
Which has 2 things maybe beneficial. First of all, even if they don't charge anybody, and don't be surprised if your abuser starts accusing you of doing some of the things, because one of the hardest things
happens a lot.
One of the hardest things police have to determine is who is the dominant aggressor, because sometimes women fight back.
Right.
And when they get there, the man has marks and she has been arrested. So that's another key thing. If you're not telling you to stand there and take it, if you think you're going to be killed, of course, you fight your way out of that. But what was I going to say? Oh, if the police come and they decide that there are no charges, there's not enough evidence to charge, insist that they still make a police report. Insist.
Oh, good.
Because you as the victim have a right to go to the police station, request a copy of that report, and they're going to try to charge you. But if you are a DV victim, you remind them that it's free for you. Any victim of a crime, any crime, can have a copy of their police report without it costing them.
That's good to know. I didn't know that. Okay, so we've talked about when to call the police. What about like a women's shelter or a women's group like YCC, or here in Davis County, we have Safe Harbor.
Safe Harbor, exactly.
What sort of organizations and resources are there for if I'm not in immediate danger, but stuff is going on a lot and it's not good? It could escalate, but I don't know.
Your safety plan should include understanding and knowing how to use the shelters.
Okay.
So you can call either one of those organizations and tell them, I believe I'm going to need to leave. And just know that when you signal your partner that you are serious about things not happening anymore, or if they get an inkling that you're going to leave, you just increased your danger tenfold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm thinking about a particular case we know about here in Utah, where when the woman actually filed for divorce, that's when it escalated into a lethal situation.
Yeah.
So if you're going to leave, you just make plans and you just leave. You don't tell them you're leaving.
Yeah.
If you don't have a place to go, that's a time to be looking at a shelter.
Mm-hmm.
Shelters are not bad. They're good. But, being in a shelter is being in a shelter. There's restrictive times. There's restrictive things about where kids can play. Not that any of that is bad, because you can be perfectly safe there. But if you're going to leave and take the kids, you should probably be calling the police and letting them know that that's what you're doing, so that your partner cannot accuse you of kidnapping.
Mm-hmm.
Let the police know, I'm in an abusive relationship. I'm going to need to leave while I figure some things out. I'm taking the kids. I am not kidnapping my children. Then there's a record there about the fact that, because they'll do that first thing.
Yeah, great advice.
She kidnapped my children.
Right. So, is it better? This is a question I get not frequently, but I haven't asked this before. Is it better to go to a shelter, or is it better to go to a friend's or family's house?
Amazingly enough, when we ask women what they want to do, they want to go to somebody else's house.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to be sure that if you're going to do that, you have a long-term arrangement there, and that there's evidence of being able to be safe there, because he could still come there.
Right.
I do know somebody who went to a house, and the person who owned the house went and got some kind of an order with the court for that person to not be able to trespass on their property. Now, that may not necessarily stop him.
Right.
But again, there's evidence of this person's inability. You are probably the safest in a shelter, because that's a safe, controlled environment. Mm. No one, they cannot say if you're there or not. If I call that shelter and say, I need to speak with so-and-so, they'll say, we can neither confirm or deny that person is here.
I've had friends go to shelters, and it is very interesting getting past the, you have to know the person's room number.
Yes, you do.
In order to get in. And at least at the 2 different shelters I have called. And and I was actually really grateful that they were so
they're very
frustrating for me, but because I was like, I'm the person who helped them get to you. Like,
here's a frustration that could happen. Here's the frustration that could happen in a shelter. And this, remember, I work very closely with Child Protective Services. Mm-hmm. I tend to have somewhat of a trust level with them. So if your abuser calls CPS, says that you've kidnapped the children, they're somewhere in a shelter, some other things that would indicate that you're not a good mother, that perhaps you've been abusive to your children, whatever they're going to say. If it's enough, CPS is going to need to investigate. Now, if they come to the only shelter around and they ask for you, they're going to hear the same thing. I can either confirm or deny. You are under control about who sees you there.
Right.
So if CPS comes and you know it, I'm telling you, go ahead and talk to them. Go ahead and talk to them. The fact that you have started making a safety plan, that you've left the relationship not only to protect yourself, but to protect your children. And that you're now in some services to help you determine next steps, including the partner. I know that's hard to hear, but eventually you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to be discussing custody.
Yeah.
So it's if CPS investigates and they have no findings, that's to your benefit.
Right.
Means no, you're not the abuser. The fact that he abused, maybe charged, abuse in the presence of children is domestic violence.
Right. Okay.
Oh, I mean, it's child abuse. It is child abuse.
Yeah, child abuse. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about what should we do if we're in serious or not so serious, at like what stage, if you are not in a dangerous situation, but it's emotionally abusive, but you don't necessarily need to leave anytime soon, who do we talk to? Who's the best person to talk to in that realm?
I think the best person to talk to in that realm might be a therapist, because the therapist can listen to the statements that you make, and maybe when somebody is abusive to you, and help give you verbiage about what you can say back, not to fight, but to sort of put it to rest. Like, two of my favorite words are nevertheless and regardless. So if somebody's in my face saying something that they don't like, that maybe I've done or said, and I know that what I've done or said is not inappropriate, I might be able to say something like, well, regardless, you cannot make those kinds of statements about me. Nevertheless, I don't want you calling me those names, regardless of what you say. And even getting bold enough to say, regardless of what you say, that is emotional abuse. And then blah, 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 blah. Nevertheless, that is emotional abuse, and that must stop. Now, just remember, anytime you set a boundary, things could begin to escalate. So you need to have a safety plan beforehand. Like, when would you do this? Where would you go? Is there going to be any problem with taking the kids out? Some women I know have planned for their children after school to go to somebody else's house because they know they're going to have this kind of confrontation. And when it turns, in case it escalates and she feels like she needs to walk out the door, she already knows where she's going. She knows her children are safe.